Day one. Day one, because you both are my day ones.
Day
I'm
one.
your day one?
That's right. Day one.
Day
one.
one.
Day one.
Day one.
Day one legislation. Day one.
Day one.
I'm going to go ahead and pass a landmark piece of legislation to make sure all retirement homes get new bingo cards every single day. What do you think about that? Because guess what?
What?
Day one, I'm passing a piece of legislation. If you saw in the debate, the other mayors were talking about vegetarianism. But I believe we should be eating all animals, killing them day one, and making sure we can all eat. What do you think about that? Day one, I will pass a piece of legislation to ban the blue-haired individuals you spoke of. Day one.
Day one.
Day one. Day one.
Day one.
Day one in legislation. I will pass as Act 3 of my legislation. I will outlaw criminals. Day one, I'm gonna build an entire dome to cover Los Santos.
Day one.
Day one. Day one. Day one. That's exactly right. Day one. Day one. I'm gonna be passing a landmark piece of legislation to outlaw crackheads. What do you think about that? Day one. Day one. That's exactly right. Day one. I'll be banning bad people and making sure we promote goodness here at Los Santos. Day one, I'll be selling my supplements on my website. Day one, as part of my legislation, part 3 of my 7-page legislation, let me tell you, I will be giving away snow baggies. Day one, that's exactly right. Day one! He's a good one. Day one! Day one! Day one! Day one! I'll be passing a landmark sweeping legislation that first and foremost, I will make sure manufacturing is done in Los Santos. Day one! Day one! I will outlaw herpes. Day one. Day one! I will ban lying. Day one! Day one! Ramasquamy. That's Ramasquamy. Day one!
Yeah.
As part of my day one legislation, part 4 states very clearly, every single day, a bottle of whiskey will be delivered to every single citizen of Los Santos. Day one. I want to, day one, stand for freedom and justice. What do you think about that? Day one. I am passing a piece of legislation to make sure medical cocaine is legal and part of your stimulus package. Day one. I'm coming into office as an outsider because day one, I'll be outlawing paranormal Day one. I'll be passing a landmark piece of legislation to outlaw robbing. Day one legislation. Day one, I'll pass a piece of legislation to make sure influencers are not taxed. Day one, if I'm elected Mayor of Los Santos, the #1 issue I'm tackling is the economy. Day one, I'm passing legislation for the policemen. How do you feel about that? Day one, I will call up my daddy and make sure that the citizens of the South Side are given adequate funding to make sure they can eat at Senor Buns just like the rest of us. Day one, I'll be making sure that there's a guitar available for free as part of your stimulus package. Day one, I'll pass a legislation where I will ban communism. Day one, I'm going to be passing a widespread legislation regarding this hospital. I will increase funding tenfold to make sure this hospital can afford Teslas. What do you think about that? This is day one. That's exactly right. Day one legislation. I'm building a massive laser. Day one, I'll pass extenuating legislation to make sure that law enforcement gets upgraded vehicles. Day one, if I'm president, I would make sure Max is unable to exist in Los Santos. I'm gonna put him in prison. Day one, legislation. Part 3, I will send help down to the South Side. Day one. That's exactly right. Lilith, take it away. Day one, that's exactly right. Day one, we're going to be outlawing gangs as part of my landmark legislation.
You're outlawing gangs.
That's exactly right. Day one legislation, I'm telling you right now, I will be passing a legalization for Zaza. Day one! Because day one, I am promising to address inflation, specifically in terms of cash, right? Because inflation is when we print so much money that it's worth, hold on, one second, actually, 1 second.
I like your enthusiasm, by the way, Will. I think that's a better way to handle it, honestly.
Inflation. Okay, yes. Inflation is when the currency loses value because there's too much supply. I will take away workers' money. Day one, if you all elect me, you'll be paid more money. Day one, I'll be passing a legislation to outlaw unions. Because day one, I will be promoting an economy of freedom. Day one, for the mechanics, I will be making sure not only are they given minimum wage, but they're given maximum wage. Day one, I'm going to stop employment completely. Yep, I think we're ready. Go ahead. Day one.
Yeah, there she goes. There it is.
You see why I like him?
No.
He's